Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this critical engagement webinar series in which we discuss, debate, and evaluate the ever-changing body of knowledge emerging as a consequence of the current COVID-19 pandemic. This series probes pandemic innovations, responses, and partnerships. This weekly seminar series is inspired by the image, characteristics, and survival story of the Cape pangolin, and so it is named after the pangolin. We seek to unpack the interconnectedness of health, humanities, environment, and science through a lens of systems thinking in this unprecedented time. I am the host of today's webinar. My name is Shivan Parusnath. I've just recently completed my doctorate on the population genetics of a lizard species called the sungazer. And I've also got an interest in illegal trade of animals, and so the pangolin is one that we often see coming up in this on this topic. So I've had a lot of personal interest in this species. I'm hosting today with the Wits team in the Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care, along with Health System Sciences and the Adler Museum of Medicine. In today's live discussion titled "The Endangered Pangolin: The True Story," we will go into detail about the sort of mascot behind the Pandemic Pangolin series. And although the name pangolin has been associated with this webinar series because of many aspects of the life history of the species, for instance, its interconnected scales that speak to us about the interconnected disciplines that make up health sciences. So it's actually a species that itself is very interesting and has also been linked in a way with this pandemic. So to learn more about the species and its potential sort of role that it's, I don't want to say role that it's played, but the way that it has been involved or named in the pandemic, we'll be talking with two experts. Firstly, Dr. Darren Pietersen, Director of Research, Tiki Highwood Foundation and Research Associate in the Mammal Research Institute and the University of Pretoria. Darren does groundbreaking work into the ecology and genetics of Temminck's pangolins in the Kalahari. Darren is deeply involved in pangolin ecological research, has supervised students investigating both ecological and genetics aspects of pangolins, and continues to be active in both the research and conservation of these amazing animals. Darren is a member of the advisory committee of the IUCN and Species Survival Commission Pangolin Specialist Group, and has been invited to present at various international conferences, as well as participate in conservation planning workshops relating to pangolins, both locally and internationally. Darren joins us today from the Lowveld. This is also true for our next presenter, Helena Atkinson, the Conservation Projects Manager of Pangolin Africa. Helena's M.Sc in Conservation Ecology on the relationship between SANParks and the communities surrounding national parks, and her extensive experience in the NGO sector and as a guide and photographer, has prepared her for positions she holds on several key international organizations working on pangolin-human interface. Helena joins us today from the Western Cape. We are delighted to have everybody here with us today. The format is that our experts will each present their insights for 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we open up for questions. In the meantime, please do put your questions as they come up into the chat or Q&A box, and we will address them at the end of the session. So Darren, let's start with you. Over to you. Let's hear what you have to say.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for that introduction, Shivan. So yeah, as Shivan mentioned, I'll be giving some background on specifically Temminck's pangolin to you. And hopefully we can also, during this presentation between Helena and I, we can hopefully also clarify some of the misconceptions that are around pangolins. I'm sure by now everybody's heard about pangolins. If you haven't, I'm not sure where you have been. But yeah, they've been heavily implicated in the current pandemic that we're experiencing. And despite their reptilian appearance, they are actually mammals. They are indeed the only group of mammals who are covered in scales rather than fur, so they're really unique. They occur quite widespread, and I've been very privileged to study these creatures in a number of localities. Amongst others, I conducted my master's research on them in the Kalahari Desert in South Africa. There are 8 species of pangolins globally. 4 of them occur in Africa and 4 of them in Asia. The most widespread of the species is the Cape or ground or Temminck's pangolin. It has various names. It is widespread in the savannas of southern and east Africa. And the remaining 3 African pangolin species are restricted to the forests of Central and West Africa, namely the white-bellied and black-bellied tree pangolins and the giant ground pangolin. Now, the Cape pangolin or ground pangolin and giant pangolin, as the name suggests, are both terrestrial species. They do not climb trees. They're large-bodied. Ground pangolins are average around 12 kilograms, depending on the environment. The 2 tree pangolin species are a lot smaller. They're only about 2 to 3 kilograms when they're adults. But because they are arboreal, they've got these very long tails that are up to about 2 or 3 times the length of their bodies. And these they use as a 5th limb when they're climbing through the trees in the forest and climbing up and down the vines in the forest. They're really well adapted to the environment. The giant pangolin, as the name suggests, is an absolute beast. And recently, researchers in Central Africa weighed an adult giant pangolin at 40 kilograms. So these are really, really big. The 4 Asian pangolin species are very similar. The Indian pangolin species is similar to the African ground pangolin species. It's also a fairly large species with a short tail. And the remaining 3 species, the Chinese, Philippine, and Sunda pangolins, are more similar to the tree pangolin species in that they are semi-arboreal, they're both arboreal and terrestrial. They've got longer tails than our ground pangolins because of this arboreality, but in general, they are larger. I speak in a correction, but I think an adult Sunda pangolin weighs about 7 or 8 kilograms. So, being mammals, pangolins give birth to live young. This is for the Temminck's pangolin species, they give birth to a single pup, or all pangolin species, as far as we know, give birth to a single pup. Temminck's pangolin gives birth about once a year to a single pup. In some regions, it seems like they only give birth once every 2nd year. So they reproduce very slowly. And although nobody actually knows for sure how old they get, field data, as well as some preliminary results, suggest that Temminck's pangolin can quite easily live to 20 or 30 years or more in the wild. This is also true for the Indian pangolin, where there's a single record of an individual living for 20 years. And then the 2 tree pangolin species, because of their smaller body size, they reproduce more frequently. So they have a single pup roughly every 8 months. Because of this and the smaller size, we believe that they are shorter lived, probably living for about 12 to 15 years each. Now, our African pangolins don't dig their own burrows, or certain Temminck's pangolin doesn't dig its own burrow. It relies on the burrows of other species for shelter. In this case, the aardvark burrow. Yeah, they sleep during the day when they're not active. And they also use this for pups and for protection, and they even generally mate in the burrows. Pangolins are very specialized mammals. Most pangolin species predominantly eat ants and termites. In Temminck's pangolin, they eat exclusively ants and termites. And even within that, they are very specific in what they eat. In any given area, they might eat only about 5 or 6 ant species and only about 2 termite species. So they're really, really specialized. And because of the specialized diet, they've got long claws in their front limbs that they can actually dig open ant nests with, or they're not strong enough to open termite mounds. They've got a very long sticky tongue that in Temminck's pangolin case is as long as the body, and that's the use to actually capture the ants and termites from within the underground galleries. As I mentioned, pangolins have been extensively implicated in our current pandemic, but let's just see what the evidence for this is. The first reports of pangolins being responsible for this pandemic came from an early press release from a Chinese university, where researchers there claim that pangolins were the source of the pandemic. However, if you actually read this article, they don't actually claim this. This seems to be in the media that we're reporting on this research misinterpreted their results and believe that that pangolins were the cause of the pandemic. But there's all additional research, of which there's been a lot of additional research since those early reports, most of them focusing on pangolins as the source of the current pandemic. And to basically summarize, there's no evidence that pangolins are the source or even intermediate host of the pandemic. So far, all the studies have shown that bats are probably the primary resource or reservoir for the coronavirus, as has also been the case with SARS and MERS, which were both believed to be bat-borne viruses. And these generally pass through an intermediary host to get to humans. In the case of SARS and MERS, the virus isolated from bats was about 96% similar to that isolated from humans. In the current pandemic, the COVID strain isolated from certain bat species, again, about 96% similar. So we're fairly sure that the bats at least are the reservoir host. But if you look at the pangolins, the virus isolated from pangolins are at most 90 to 91% similar. So this suggests that they are actually in no way a reservoir host, certainly not a reservoir host or intermediary host to the virus. And if anything, they're probably also affected by the virus, much like humans are. And this is also further supported by the samples in which coronavirus has been isolated from pangolins have all stemmed from pangolins that have been in trade and that have actually died from respiratory illnesses very similar to those caused by the coronavirus, which also suggests that rather than being the cause of the virus, they too are a victim. And how does this come about? As with SARS and MERS and the current coronavirus, all of these viruses are believed to have emerged in so-called wet markets in Asia. Basically, wet markets are basically just open-air markets, or sometimes in buildings, but markets where live and dead animals of numerous different species are all confined in very unhygienic conditions, very stressful conditions. And any animal that's under stress sheds viruses or diseases a lot more prolifically than a healthy animal would. At the same time, because they are stressed, the immune system is down. Pangolins, to start with, have a poor immune systems, and then also further stress in these environments. So you've got a combination of various animals from various species in a very stressful environment, low immunity, and high viral loads. And this is the perfect breeding ground for pandemics such as SARS, MERS, and the current coronavirus. And basically what happens is viruses particularly are very prone to DNA interchange, so basically recombining their DNA. And this is the perfect environment with so many different viruses going around, the viruses being able to infect species that aren't usually able to infect. Viruses or different strains of viruses infect the same individual, the DNA recombines, and suddenly you get a new virus that, as in this case, can actually result in a pandemic. But as I mentioned, on the current evidence suggests that pangolins are not the cause for this. And in fact, a recent study that has been looking at viral loads in wild healthy pangolins in Malaysia that have sort of been confiscated from the very initial stages of the illegal wildlife trade, we actually found that they had absolutely no viruses of any genus or family whatsoever. They were completely virus-free. But as studying other mammals, as specifically rodents, they also a different study looked at rodents. They also found that at the beginning of the wildlife trade, or when they just first captured, they've got very low or no viruses. And as they move down the chain, so as they spend more time in transit under these unhygienic, stressful conditions, so the number of viruses that they actually house increases. This again, basically humans have created a perfect storm for pandemics in that we are pushing all these animals together in unhygienic, stressful environments, and we're just forming a breeding ground for these viruses to actually originate and spread. So basically we're killing ourselves. And if this makes sense, I'll happy to answer any questions you have after our next speaker. And yeah, I think Helena's now going to tell you about some other problems affecting pangolins. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Darren. Thanks for the insightful introduction to pangolins. And I think, it's interesting how in today's world, news spreads so quickly that by the time this mention of the pangolin being a potential, reservoir for the coronavirus had started spreading, by the time the sort of clarification that it wasn't necessarily true what had emerged, it was kind of too late to take it back, because once it's in people's heads, you can't erase what they've already heard and started spreading and talking about. So you do wonder about those long-term ramifications of public image, and is it good for them or bad for them? So that's something that I find quite interesting. As Darren has said, please do feel free to type any questions that you have for him in the chat box. And I will now hand over to Helena So Helena, if you're ready, take it away.
Thank you so much, Shivan. Thank you to everybody joining us today. This is a topic that we can talk about a lot, and it's an animal that we care about very deeply. So any opportunity we get to talk about it, we will happily take. So as Shivan introduced me, I'm from the nonprofit organization called Pangolin.Africa. And one of the things we particularly focus on is awareness raising of the plight of the pangolin, because there are just so many people in the world who don't even know what a pangolin is. We realize that that is a big role that we can play in the conservation of the species. So apart from people not even knowing that pangolins exist and what they are, and that they're in fact a mammal, even though they have scales, there's also some really shocking facts around the state of pangolins in the world. All 8 of the species, all species that Darren mentioned, are in fact in danger of going extinct. In fact, the Chinese pangolin is believed to, for all intents and purposes, to already be extinct. And one of the big reasons for this, the main reason, is that in the last 10 years, the estimate is that 1 million pangolins were illegally traded. So it's given the pangolin the unfortunate title of the most trafficked mammal in the world. And I'm sure it didn't actually want that title. Just some images of the scale seizures that we often see on the news. This is often the product that we see of the pangolin that gets traded illegally is the scales in these big bins like this. So this actually then translates to 1 pangolin taken from the wild every 5 minutes. And this is an absolute mind-blowing fact to a lot of people. People who are wildlife enthusiasts, people who have spent a lot of time in the bush, who go on safari, actually often will tell you, but I've never seen one. I've spent many, many years in the wild looking for one. Myself, I've been working in the conservation industry for 14 years, and I only saw my first live wild one last year. So the idea of one being taken from the wild every 5 minutes really blows your mind. Again, just an image here of the way the pangolin products are exhibited in markets as part of this illegal trade. But there are other issues as well that pangolins face, habitat loss being a very big one. Climate change, in fact, starting to play a bigger role in the survival of pangolins. In South Africa as well, Southern Africa, road mortalities play a role. And then unfortunately, electrified fences as well. So the 4 Asian species are currently classified as critically endangered or endangered. The 4 African species are classified as endangered or vulnerable. This is the IUCN Red Data List classifications. Luckily though, in 2016, at the CITES convention that happened in South Africa in Johannesburg, the proponents of this, or for high levels of protection for pangolins, and Darren was actually quite integral in that process, they were successful in putting it forward that CITES should uplist all 8 pangolin species to Appendix 1. So Appendix 1 under CITES, which is the Convention in the Trade of Endangered Flora and Fauna, this is the highest level of protection that CITES offers any animal species or plant species. So this means that there is absolutely no international trade allowed in pangolins for commercial purposes. Now, CITES as an entity or as an enforcing body has been criticized quite heavily over the last few years because it really ultimately is not a law enforcement agency. So it really depends on governments and countries themselves to enforce these laws. So it was really good news, but it was not necessarily the be all and end all for pangolin conservation. So the trade that we are talking about as this big threat is both local and international. In Africa, it often gets used in traditional medicine or muti, and then we know about pangolin scales, pangolin blood as well, often being prescribed in traditional Chinese medicine as well. Now, what we've just got to remember, and I'm sure the audience I'm speaking to now actually know more about this than I do, but it is the same as fingernails. Pangolin scales have got no medicinal properties, so it's like chewing your fingernail. So it's really a use of pangolins that should be discouraged and should really be a focus of stopping. In Central and West Africa, pangolins do form part of the bushmeat market, which, you know, is in conservation circles, that is a tough one to work around. You really have to provide alternative sources of protein if you want to engage with people around refraining from eating pangolins. In Africa, pangolins are also often given to dignitaries, the meat. It's also often presented to chiefs. But in every country that you find pangolins, in every culture, pangolins have different significance and different uses. So there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to the actual use of pangolins. In Asia, the meat is seen as a delicacy, and you know, there's been extensive research on how it actually is presented in restaurants, how much people are paying for it. And you know, some of the research is showing that you can pay up to $3,000 to eat a pangolin in a restaurant, even though it is illegal. And it is ultimately our opinion that the demand from Asia is unsustainable and will be the demise of both the Asian species and then increasingly the African species. So the Wildlife Justice Commission published a report recently where they looked at the trade, what are the main routes, what are the main smuggling, the people involved in the smuggling, and they found that Nigeria and Vietnam seems to be the main route. And the study that they did over 4 years showed that about 70% of the trade, the illegal trade, took place in that illegal route. It seems like it wasn't necessarily something that the people involved were looking to trade in pangolins. It was just the product that at the moment gives them the most money. So previously these were often illegal ivory routes. So now it seems that they've switched to pangolins, pangolin scales as the product. So quite scary is that this commission found that in 2019, the size of the seizures actually tripled. So the size of the average seizure, it used to be about 2.4 tons. And in 2019, it jumped to about 6.8 tons every time a seizure was made. So that shows how much the demand has increased in a very short period of time. So what, you know, in the next few years, we're probably going to see a double and triple again. They believe that one of the main ways to combat this is through transnational investigative efforts. So to really focus on the routes, the people involved, the syndicates involved, because it's really ultimately crime syndicates, and they are at a very complicated, very sophisticated level. So it's going to take a massive effort to actually stop this trade. Climate change has become something that a lot of pangolin conservationists are very concerned about. And in fact, there's a woman called Wendy Panino associated with Wits. And she's just completed her PhD study, and her study focused on understanding the body temperature, diet, and activity pangolin patterns of ground pangolins in a semi-arid environment. She actually also did this research in the Kalahari at the Tualu Reserve. I know that the organizers of this talk was very interested in getting her involved, but she's full on finishing up her PhD right now, so she couldn't actually join us. But understanding the impact of climate change on the area you will find pangolins, whether it's going to shift, whether it's going to contract, the impact it will have on activity time, because pangolins are nocturnal. So what it will do in terms of higher temperatures, will they come out earlier? Will they feed later into the night? And what is the ultimate impact on their food availability? So as Darren said, in Southern Africa, we have the Temminck pangolin, and they exclusively eat ants and termites. So, you know, will there be enough of these available? And in fact, they get most of their water from the prey that they eat. So how will that affect their water dependence? So this is a complicated topic. And yeah, I think we're all really looking forward to Wendy's results and her recommendations. Then, of course, in Africa, habitat loss is a big threat. Any new infrastructure causes territory to be fragmented, any new roads, any new settlements, of course, mines, and then agriculture, and the use of pesticides in agriculture has a big impact on pangolins. Something that is quite particular to Southern Africa as an issue for pangolins is the fact that we have so many livestock farms and reserves that are putting up electrified fences. And this is only increasing. And some research that Darren actually did showed that on average, there's about 1,000 mortalities annually of pangolins on electrified fences in Southern Africa. The reason why they die on the fences is because the Temminck's ground pangolin is bipedal, so it walks on its back legs, and its defense mechanism in nature, which is very successful against predators, is for them to curl around electric fences or to curl in a ball. So when they walk into an electric fence, because there's no scales on the tummy, they will curl around it and they will then be stuck on the fence and they will receive multiple shocks, which ultimately is what the animal then succumbs from. So mitigation of this is quite a priority for pangolin conservation. So one of the main things that we put forward as a solution is this interdisciplinary collaboration. So a webinar like today is a very good place to talk about how can different disciplines support and understand the reasons why we have this problem, but how do we ultimately reduce demand? How do we reduce trafficking and poaching? And as I said earlier, we have to talk about what is sustainable livelihood alternatives for people who actually depend on pangolins for their livelihoods. Something the IUCN Pangolin Specialist Group provides is the ability to do conservation planning on a global scale, so that you know, the priorities for each species can be set, and that, you know, in Africa and also in Asia, we can truly as entities work together, because this is what it will take. We then also have to really be aware of wildlife health. So what Darren spoke about in these wet markets, you know, what are the conditions wildlife is being kept under? How do we engage with nature? You know, what do we eat? How do we slaughter it? Those are some critical issues that need to be discussed. And at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a call for all wet markets to be shut down. This is unfortunately, we believe, not really a viable option. This is not going to immediately solve the problem, because you create a host of other problems then as well. So wildlife health and the conditions animals are kept under should be a very serious point of discussion. Then of course, climate change is going to have to be part of all of the solutions, and it will have to be fused into all the conversations about the different things we put forward as what's important for the conservation of the species. And then also research, you know, being cohesive in our approach to research. What is still outstanding? What do we not know? What should be priorities, and how that research gets made available. But then also training rangers and wildlife authorities so that they fully understand the challenge that they're up against and have the tools to actually do the conservation on the ground. So at Pangolin.Africa, our focus is on improving the biological database. So getting as much information as possible out in the field. One way we do this is through citizen science. So if you see a pangolin, we have a tool through WhatsApp that you can alert us to the sighting. So we get a better understanding of how often pangolins are being seen. Also, if you were lucky enough in the past to have seen one, you can go onto our website, you can record that historical sighting. We also feed that information into the Pangolin Specialist Group at IUCN. Then of course, awareness raising and education initiatives. We produced a wonderful documentary called Eye of the Pangolin last year that you can go and have a look at. It's available for free on YouTube. I really encourage everybody to go and have a look at this. Then something we are looking at is how to mitigate the mortalities on electric fences. This is quite an issue that we are very passionate about, working with Darren and the Tiki Highwood Foundation on this as well. Then we are also currently busy engaging with the tourism industry around the guidelines for guides, rangers, trackers when they do see pangolins in the wild. What is appropriate, what is acceptable, how should they engage with the animal? It is quite surprising how little of that is out there, and how often you will see selfies of people posing next to a pangolin that they saw on a game drive. there's some real implications in the well-being of the animal when you do this. So this is an ongoing project that we're currently busy with. Then, of course, one of the main things that is critical for pangolin conservation is the rescue of individuals from the illegal wildlife trade. And we are lucky in South Africa that we've got the African Pangolin Working Group and then the Johannesburg Wildlife Vet Hospital, and as well as another organization in Hoedspruit called Rhino Rescue. And they are doing incredible work in actually retrieving pangolins from the illegal trade and then actually rehabilitating them. So part of the rehabilitation is to ensure that animal is healthy. We do what we call a soft release, where you spend time with the animal foraging, making sure that it can actually fend for itself in the wild. Then you would fit a satellite and a radio tracker on it. And then you can actually, after that, follow that animal to see if your release has been successful. So this is from a recent release we did in the Kalahari. And that is it from Pangolin.Africa. Please go and have a look at our website. We like to say we, as an organization, we team up with other organizations. We're teaming up to save a species. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to this audience.
Thank you very much, Helena. Very interesting. Always sad to hear about the many threats that pangolins face, but you know, it's wonderful to hear from people such as yourself and Darren to hear about the many you know, the many activities that are going on to educate, where, you know, create, collect data, and just kind of overall work towards protecting the species. So I think it does sound quite hopeful. And you're talking about, you know, how the pangolin is such an exciting species to see in the wild. I myself spent many, many years doing fieldwork in pangolin territory, never saw one. The closest I've come to seeing one in the wild was using a VR headset. So I hope that I one day have the fortune of seeing one in the wild. We've got some great questions coming in. So I will try and direct them to either Helena or Darren, but please do feel free to just jump in wherever you have some insight. So starting from the top, Amina Issa in Dar es Salaam asks, can you explain why traditional medicine uses pangolin parts in the medicine? What is the historical reason behind this in Chinese culture? And I think, you know, within Africa, you can understand it's an African animal. People see them around and might, you know, have some connection to this animal and some reason for using it. But what about in China?
Can I go ahead and answer that?
Please do, yeah.
Okay. So this is the same as with rhino horn. It's a cultural myth that gets perpetuated, but it's also been actually prescribed in traditional Chinese medicine. So it is part of the recognized methodology to treat certain ailments in Asia. Earlier this year, there was great excitement because the Chinese government said that they will no longer allow this, and this pangolin product should no longer be used in traditional medicine, but it's not actually completely been removed from the list of recommended ways to treat certain ailments. It especially gets used for blood conditions, so leukemia. It often gets recommended by doctors for women who have problems with lactating when they breastfeed. So it's superstition. There's no original proof that this was an active ingredient that actually cures some of these ailments. So that's part of why we believe it can be stopped, but it's also part of why it is so hard, because it is traditional beliefs, it's ancient cures and recommendations for certain ailments.
Thanks, Helena. And if I understand correctly, you know, there are a large group of Chinese nationals that are fighting to change these perceptions within China itself. So I think there are a lot of people on that side also trying to fight this battle. Okay, we've got a general question here. In what ways can environmental activist organizations and African and Asian governments use the current global health crisis to the advantage of the pangolin in terms of improving awareness, protection, and conservation? And either of you can go for that one.
I'll jump in. So I think in a sense it already has helped in that a lot of more people have actually heard about the pangolin, whereas a couple of months ago, last year, very few people actually had even heard about a pangolin, never mind known what it was. unfortunately, with the pandemic, they have been painted in a very bad light by and large. But at least they have now heard about the pangolins. So now the next step would at least be trying to actually get the right information out there to them about what pangolins are that actually aren't the cause of this pandemic.
Yeah. A similar question here from Wolfgang Prisa is, could one use a scare tactic, e.g. pangolins as source of new infectious diseases, whether true or not, to deter customers? Or do you think that could potentially backfire? With bats, the concern is that people persecute them as sources of emerging viruses. So in that particular, so it's similar to the last question, but do you think that this would put off potential customers from consuming pangolin pulp? What are your thoughts and opinions on that?
I don't actually think it will deter people. I think the only thing that possibly could happen is that more people would try and persecute and kill pangolins. I don't think that would necessarily be the solution. We're already dealing with so much misinformation and myth and superstition and traditional beliefs that adding another one into the mix, I actually don't think will be the solution. And we have seen in the past with other animals blamed for pandemics, that there's mass extermination of those species. Yeah. So it's important to get the right facts out there.
Yeah, very good point. Thanks, Helena. From Ben Regis, are there any well-known leaders in South Africa making the conservation of pangolins their goal and joining up with parties such as religious, political, or business leaders? I know that within traditional medicine, there are leaders in certain groups in certain areas that do care about conservation. It's not just about medicine. They do care about the longevity of some of these animals in the wild. So what are the chances of teaming up with more than just conservationists?
I think that is very important. As you rightly point out, a lot of even traditional healers are concerned about the longevity, because ultimately if pangolins go extinct, then they're also losing basically one of their products, one of the chief ingredients in many medications. In the past, we have had colleagues who did work very closely with some of the traditional healers, especially up in Johannesburg. Unfortunately, the person that they were working with passed away, and the person that's taken over from him isn't quite as conservationally minded. But that's, as with anything, it's just minor setback. You go ahead, forge ahead, find new relationships and re-engage with them, actually just re-engage with them and try and build up those relationships again, and try and let them see that ultimately we're working to save the species, but we're also working to save their culture and their traditions, because, as I mentioned, if pangolins go extinct, they extinct to everyone, not just the conservationists.
Question from Keith Fiernes. What happens if they do go extinct here in Africa? As someone that studies lizards, people don't often have a lot of respect or interest in lizards. So people often ask, why do we care? Well, let me not go on about it. Let me pose the question to you. What happens if pangolins go extinct in Africa?
So we have, I think there's a twofold issue here. There is the fact that, we will have a serious insect and ant problem. That's a big part of the role they play in the ecology is, they keep those numbers under control, they aerate soil. Every animal has its place and has a role. But I think also it would say a lot about us as humanity, that an animal that is completely vulnerable, and in fact, when you encounter it, it often will roll up into a ball. So you can just pick it up and carry it off. So the fact that an animal like that would get destroyed or go extinct in our lifetime says a lot about our lack of care and our lack of understanding of how quick this can happen. I mean, we unfortunately might not even realize when the last pangolin has been taken from the wild. So that's a very scary situation. And it really, with everything we know today, the information we have, the science we have, if that happens, I think as humans, we should really, really be ashamed of ourselves.
Yeah, I think a lot of time in conservation, humans often wonder, how does it affect them or us? And I think it's important to remember the intrinsic value that every species has. Every species has evolved to fulfill a particular niche. It's not just about how it affects us, it's the broader ecosystem. And maybe we don't see the effects of it until 100 or few hundred thousand years when it's too late. So Naledi Mpanza asks, you mentioned that there's a market for pangolins in restaurants, despite that being illegal. Are there any efforts to involve citizens in calling out these establishments in the same way that you try and when people spot wild pangolins, you send in records? Are people kind of engaged with calling out these restaurants, bringing it to the attention of authorities, probably more in Asia than here in Africa? Do you know about those kind of initiatives?
Yes, so certainly in Asia, the consumption of pangolins in restaurants is mainly in Asia. Up in North, Central and West Africa, as Helena mentioned, there is bushmeat, but that's not really in markets or in restaurants as such as more open air markets where you can buy pangolins. But the consumption of pangolins in restaurants is most prevalent in Asia. And there has been an increasing drive to actually engage members of the public to report those instances to either the various organizations involved in trying to counteract that or directly to the authorities so that they can be investigated and so the restaurants can be prosecuted.
Cool, that's great to hear. Helen Lunn asks, on February 24th, 2020, China outlawed all illegal wildlife trade. Is there any new evidence that suggests that this might be having an impact on pangolin numbers?
As far as we know, not yet, because pangolins are still being recommended as part of traditional Chinese medicine. It was not completely removed from the, I hate saying this word in this audience, but as far as I know, it's the pharmacopoeia. And it's still listed in there as a potential ingredient that can be prescribed. So it still needs to be completely outlawed, but then also removed from that completely, and then it has to be enforced. Ultimately, that's what will make the difference.
So I'd like to just add a question on here, following on from the previous question. So do we have evidence that there are still pangolins getting into China since February 24th? Has that still been happening?
Very much so, yeah. It's still basically the smuggling and the trade has gone on unabated. It's, as far as I'm aware, there's actually been no measurable difference even since China outlawed it. It might be a bit more under the radar and a bit more covert, but it's still going, still continuing, unfortunately.
Okay, and one more follow-up question from me. How, in the light of this now being illegal within China, how is it that they are being brought in? Is it under the guise of another, being another animal species, or is it simply smuggled in? How are they actually getting into the country?
I think it's a combination of it gets labeled as a different animal product, but it is also very sophisticated criminal networks. So, there's people along the way involved. I mean, we even see it in South Africa that, law enforcement, national parks authorities, or individuals are involved. So it's a combination of, people being fooled by the paperwork and the what they get told the actual product is. So training of wildlife authorities and the people who work at the ports and who work at the borders to recognize pangolin scales is very crucial work. But then, a lot of it is a very sophisticated, complicated criminal network.
Okay, from Nadine Jardine, given the unbelievable costs of the pandemic, whether it was a bat or pangolin carrier, is someone thinking of a way countries can offer resources to communities or people for saving and conserving pangolins? And if I'm correct in understanding Nadine's question, maybe outside of just NGOs and organizations, going more to the community level?
There are definitely organizations that are engaging with the communities directly in general to conserve pangolins. But I'm not aware of any sort of monetary assistance or things like that to actually assist these communities in this time, but I'm sure that they are out there.
I'm thinking of a case in Kenya where, many of the warriors that lived in Kenya would historically kill lions, and also, lions would cause problems with their livestock, so they would hunt down the lions. And they've actually been brought into conservation, whereby they are taught how to track, and they're actually employed as trackers and are actively involved within conservation. So maybe at some point we can get to that level where people within communities where pangolins are targeted can actually become themselves involved in research. And by spreading out the researchers, you maybe make it more difficult for people to poach in those areas. That's my thought there.
An interesting feature about that in the documentary we made, Eye of the Pangolin, at Sangha Lodge, where the researchers that work there and the owners of the lodge have involved the local people to actually be part of the research team. And they spend their days with the pangolins, actually watching them forage, which is not easy because they are one of the arboreal species. So there has been successful examples of that. But that is one of the most complicated solutions that we have in conservation, is taking people that have traditional relationships with resources and then switching that relationship into one of protection. It's one of the most successful, but it is also one of the most complicated, because you're dealing with many, many years of that relationship. You are affecting people's cultural identity. It's not just always as simple as, well, you want to eat a pangolin, but I'll give you a chicken instead, so you should be fine because you have a different source of protein. It actually is it's a long and complicated process, but if it does work, it has definitely proven to be one of the most successful solutions.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think at some point we hope that it does get to the level where sort of within every province we've got the community on the ground actually involved in that research. Okay, so there are a lot of questions coming in. I haven't had time to read every one, but I am being fed them. So would it be possible to identify the name of every traditional Chinese medicine trader that incorporates pangolin scales and have them outlawed across the globe, even if it's not within China? It's possible that practitioners of this may not enjoy being raided for a few bottles of pills and shut down for trading in illegal substances. Darren, we spoke a little bit about this with regards to restaurants. What about law enforcement of this within traditional medicine in China?
Within traditional medicine, it's going to be a lot harder, substantially harder than with the restaurants. A while back, I was in Hong Kong and I visited just some of the commercial, basically the equivalent of our pharmacies here. And every mall had about 10, 12, 15 traditional medicine shops where they're selling various traditional medicines. I didn't see any pangolin scales being overtly sold, but shark fin and abalone, the other usual things were quite openly sold there. So just the sheer number of retail shops that are selling various traditional medicines is staggering. Not all of them obviously do sell pangolin derivatives, but there are certainly probably many thousands of them that do that. So just policing it, firstly, would be very problematic. But secondly, to a large extent, from what I understand, is that many of the governments are actually involved in the trade. Because pangolins have been involved in the certain traditional Chinese medicine for many millennia already. There's in parallel to the illegal trade in pangolin derivatives, there's also a legal trade. And there certainly have been instances of where pangolin scales have been confiscated from the illegal trade. The government actually auctions them back off to the sort of legal trade and basically legalizes those traded scales. So as far as I can see, there isn't really any buy-in or any impetus from the government to realistically stop this trade. And I think until you get that actual governmental buy-in, you're not going to easily stop the trade, even if you do name and shame or ban certain traders. It's not likely to work, unfortunately.
Okay, that's an ongoing fight. Renee van de Wiel, thanks you both for the informative presentations, and addresses a question to Helena. So we talked about the fact that shutting down wet markets would be complicated or unfeasible. Is it possible to get more elaboration on this? Have there at any time been any pushback from Asian authorities about restricting trade of pangolin products, asserting a cultural relevance argument? Okay, so we have kind of covered this. Are notions of race or ethnicity problematic in these global conservation campaigns? Okay, so we've already spoken a little bit about this, but do any of you have anything extra to say about that? We can move on to the next question.
I can just expand a little bit on my comment about the wet markets. That is, you know, by no means a thing that I think should continue. I think just in terms of being realistic, that is, you know, everybody cried out for, you know, shut down all wet markets immediately. This is the source of the problem. So the simple solution is shut it down. This should not be going on anymore. And then we won't have any, you know, jumps of zoonotic diseases from animals to humans if we keep them in cleaner conditions. But it is the way that animals are consumed in many Asian countries. It is the way they are kept. It is where people buy their food from. So looking to that as the be-all and end-all solution, I don't think is practical. In the long term, I certainly believe that should be what gets done. It is, I mean, we saw what happened to the whole world. The whole world came to a standstill because of this. So even if we don't do it for the sake of the animals, we should do it for the sake of ourselves. So it is a long-term, you know, solution. It will take governments to buy into it. It will take law enforcement to buy into it. It will take consumers to ultimately buy into it as well. But in the next at least 10 years, I don't believe that will be the solution that ultimately works. So we have to keep looking in other places as well, as a parallel process to ending wet markets.
Excellent. I think, you know, to add in my 2 cents, the call to shut down wet markets was obviously a very extreme, very rash response that came up, and, you know, many petitions and so on, and Facebook groups to shut these things down. And I think sometimes the very sort of harsh reactions aren't necessarily the ones that work. You know, you do need this kind of maybe longer, more rigorous kind of program to not necessarily close them down, but as you say, you know, change the way that animals are kept, change the conditions in which animals are kept, and that sort of thing. Because I think with things like this, just to simply shut them down and say that's it, you can't do it anymore, people will still open them up and they'll still carry on, and, you know, in the black market. So you just need to address it openly and not just say shut it down. That's the way I see it. Okay, we've got a last question, and then we will kind of announce a little bit about the next week. But to our audience, Darren and Helena have agreed to stay on for a little bit longer after the end of the session, formally at 2 o'clock. So if there are more questions coming in, we will still carry on taking them for a little bit. So please do continue sending them in if you have more questions. We've got a question from Lewel Nirenda. There was an arrest recently here in Malawi of someone selling a pangolin. To me, that was an opportunity to know its origin and make a protective action for the environment. Where do we strike a balance between identification of reservoirs and applying country marshal roles?
Can I just clarify that the question has to do with identifying exactly where the pangolin was found, and that, you know, talking about that more openly has a role to play?
I think I'm not entirely sure. I think it's open to your interpretation.
Okay, I can maybe say to that then that it is a very, very fine balance right now between making it clear where pangolins are found, putting pressure on government to keep those areas protected, putting pressure on government to keep putting resources into those areas. And then also in our education initiatives and our awareness raising around pangolins, you know, how much do we talk about where pangolins are found, how much you can get for them on the black market currently? It's a very complicated issue that, you know, we have many debates ourselves amongst pangolin conservationists, even in our own organization. You know, how much do you go into rural areas and announce, you know, there's the special animal, and right now an Asian person could possibly offer you as much as 300,000 Rand for it. So it's a complicated one to how much do you make public, how much do you promote? But there certainly is value in understanding the protected areas where pangolins are found and why they should remain intact and why in fact they should be expanded.
Thanks, Helena. Okay, the last question that's in the chat at the moment is from Setati Renofeke. I think of Helena saying that they're so vulnerable. I'm an educator. Can we make children's shows, books, or comics here in Southern Africa and share with our neighbors to the north to get children involved in their value and protection?
Yeah, there's actually quite a few materials available. And if anybody would like to contact me about that specifically, there's a few books that have published, comics, posters. Darren's been involved in that as well. So there's material available. What we find is that it certainly has to be in the mother tongue of the children, especially in rural areas. So that's part of ongoing work that, you know, almost every pangolin organization is involved in, is how to translate material, how to make it accessible in some of the more rural areas. But there's certainly been wonderful material produced in South Africa. In fact, there's a comic right now that we've been offered to use in our school education program that, you know, anybody who's interested, I can put you in touch with the individual who did that.
Wonderful, Helena. I love comic books. I would love to read that myself. I think, you know, for everyone who hasn't watched Eye of the Pangolin, please do check it out. It is a serious documentary, and as someone that's very emotional about this stuff, I actually did find it quite tough to watch myself, but I think it's important. And I think, you know, even though it is tough subject matter, I think if you can show it to kids, I think we should show that to kids as well. You know, it is a reality of the world. So I don't think we need to necessarily shy away from it. We've got another question coming in, but I'm just thinking maybe we should just put up the slide for next week's event. Let's quickly talk about what's happening next week so that the audience knows what will be going on then. And then we'll come back to the questions, and then we've got a little bit more time for people that still have questions to ask. So next week's talk in the Pandemic Pangolin series is about community engagements. It'll be hosted by Nabila Bimath, and will be presented by Imtiaz Suleiman and Vinayak Bardwaj. So they'll be talking about their experience in all sorts of different crises and how we can bring those kind of types of knowledge and those levels of experience into community engagement through times of a pandemic such as the one that we're currently going through. So please do tune in for that same time next week. And let's carry on with some questions. So we've got a question now from Pat Horn. And that question is, what animals eat pangolins over and above humans?
Mostly humans. But lions do eat a couple of them, especially younger animals. Younger pangolins don't have as well developed scales, so the scales are softer. And also smaller, so when they roll into a ball, they're more likely that a lion can actually get its whole mouth around the animal and be able to crush it. Whereas an adult, those scales are so hard, the lions just can't get through them. So they really are well protected from most predators other than humans. But yeah, they have lions do eat them. Certain honey badgers specialize on pangolins. They absolutely annihilate pangolins. And hyenas also eat a lot of pangolins, or certainly again the younger ones. And up in Central Africa, the smaller tree pangolin species. There's also been a few records of crocodiles eating pangolins. And then over in Asia, I know I've seen records of tigers and leopards eating pangolins. I think there's also a record of a sloth bear as well eating pangolins. So it's sort of mostly your larger predators who opportunistically will eat pangolins.
But as you said, those numbers probably come nowhere near what the impact that we have on them.
Absolutely not even a fraction of what the humans are doing to pangolins.
Yeah. Grace Devon has a question. Why is their use rising in commercialization of medicine? Is it related to fertility and sex health claims? And I think, you know, we have spoken a bit about medicine, but why perhaps today is it so commercialized? And maybe commercialization is the key itself, but let me pass that over to you.
I think one of the reasons is, you know, there seems to be this idea in some Asian countries now that you can show off your ability to purchase some of the products. So that seems to be the one reason, the one explanation. But I think some of those uses have always been there, and the Asian pangolins have always been used for that. It's just now that there's been a shift to the African species. That's why it's really become part of, you know, why it's on our radar as conservationists involved in African pangolin species. So that's why I said in my presentation that the Chinese pangolin is, for all intents and purposes, extinct. So it's basically that the Asian ones are gone and they're coming for the African ones now. There's a lot of people that believe that the use of pangolins in traditional medicine in Africa, and even to some extent the bushmeat market, would have been sustainable if there wasn't the pressure from the Asian market for African pangolins.
Okay, kind of a follow-up question here from Jerome Awere. Is there an irony here that the more precious they become because of impending extinction and poaching, the more their cost rises, and as you said, maybe the sort of the bragging rights to having one increase? Does that actually increase their desirability?
Yeah, it does seem so. It seems that there's a bit of a race to get your hands on pangolin products. And it's certainly, you know, there's the use of animal products in traditional Chinese medicine is very complex, and the history is, you know, it's actually fascinating. And I'm certainly no expert on that. There's been quite a few books published. One that I found particularly interesting is called Poached, and it's by a journalist called Rachel Love Newer, which explains a lot of this. There's, you know, it's a complicated history, and solving it is going to take complicated solutions as well. But there does definitely seem to be the fact that people would like to show off that I can purchase this, I have access to this. There is the showing off of affluence seems to affect the use of animal products these days in Asian countries quite a bit.
Yeah. All right. Well, there are no further questions in the chat box currently, but let's give it a few more minutes. If anybody does have a burning question, I see we still have 46 participants in the chat. So, okay, we've got another question. Tiana Swartz, in Southern Africa, we revered pangolins and did not kill them, I read, in traditional medicine. Why did this change?
It doesn't actually change. It's, as with right across Africa, the use or how pangolins are viewed often varies culturally. So certain cultures will revere them, and sort of some up in Zimbabwe, even many tribes in South Africa as well, they are revered. And if somebody comes across a pangolin, the tradition is that they take them to a chief and present them to the chief as a gift. So they really are revered. But in other cultures, they believe that if you stumble across a pangolin, it's going to mean that there's going to be a drought. And the only way to actually stem the drought is you take the pangolin and slaughter it next to a river without letting the blood drip on the ground at all. And that's why you have to slaughter it over a river. So it's a complicated issue, and it does vary culturally. Yeah, certainly in many African cultures that are revered and they are respected, and you're allowed to touch them at all. But yeah, various culturally, and there also has been, especially in the more urban areas, there has been a breakdown of this cultural tradition, I believe. And whereas sort of your cultural roots or your cultural beliefs are now being overridden by monetary gain in many instances, unfortunately.
Okay, while we wait to see if there are any last questions, I've got a question myself. So with the sungazer lizards that I have been working on for the past decade, their use within South Africa, from what I understand, is actually fairly minimal, and, you know, a small fraction compared to poaching for the pet trade, because when they when people use them within South Africa, you know, one sungazer body can actually last a fairly long time for the kind of medicine that is made from their body parts. So in that way, it's used fairly sparingly. And I wouldn't necessarily think that, you know, taking one or two animals out of the population maybe in a year does that much damage to them. It's mostly from the international pet trade. What do you think are the impacts of poaching within Africa of African pangolins versus the poaching of African pangolins for the Asian market? You know, what percentage do you think gets used within Africa, and what percentage is taken outside of Africa?
Yeah, certainly, as you say, certainly within Africa, certainly up until recently, I think the trade was fairly sustainable. As you mentioned, very much similar to your sungazer lizards, pangolin skins that have been monitored in multi markets have have stayed there for years, especially in the rural areas where, as you say, basically a person will only need one pangolin scale, and pangolins have upwards of 200 scales on them. So that one scheme can potentially serve many people for many, many years. So the turnover has generally been low. But also, for the great part, we actually don't even know where those pangolins were sourced from. There may have been roadkills that the guys just opportunistically picked up that may have already been killed in electrified fences. So also those animals also aren't known, although some of them probably were specifically killed for that trade. Yeah, certainly up in Central and West Africa, because they are extensively used for bushmeat, they are killed a lot more. I know the estimates range from many tens to many hundreds of thousands of pangolins killed per year in the forests there. But even then, it probably has been fairly sustainable, but with both the increase of the human population and the changes in traditional uses, and then, as you say, certainly the international trade, it's just gone from sustainable use to completely commercialization and completely unsustainable. In terms of the actual proportion that's used locally versus internationally, I wouldn't even be able to have a guess at that, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, there are no further questions at this moment. So I think if we don't get one within the next 30 seconds or so, I think we could perhaps end the discussion here. And Helena and Darren, are your, I need to actually have a look at the website. Are your email addresses there? Because I imagine there might be some people that might have further questions that might want to bring up later. If you feel happy sharing it, would you maybe want to put your email in the chat box, and then people could write to you if they have got further questions after this?
It should also be up on the website, but yeah, we certainly drop them in the chat box as well.
Okay. Kathy Burns herself has a question for you, perhaps in closing. How hopeful are you about their future?
Always optimistic. As Rod Cassidy says, who's a fairly well-known conservationist, if you aren't optimistic in conservation, you need to commit suicide. So we have to remain optimistic. I do believe that it is possible, especially if we all start working together and all start collaborating. And yeah, I do believe, as with any species, there's enough people that care about them. There's enough resources available to do something positive for them. And I do believe that we can certainly stem the tide and save all 8 pangolin species from extinction.
Yeah, I agree with, we have to be optimistic. But I do think one thing that counts in the favor of pangolins is that the people that are involved in the conservation of pangolins are probably some of the most passionate and committed individuals I have ever met in my life. So you don't get involved with pangolins and then, after a while you walk away. It's really something that the individuals across the world are 100, it is their life's work, and they are absolutely dedicated to the species. And I think in many ways that is going to be what saves pangolins, is the commitment of individuals. So that's, there's many people involved, many organizations, and incredible work.
Beautiful. All right. Well, it's a very nice positive note to end this discussion on. I think it's been interesting to talk about the mascot of the actual webinar series itself, to learn a bit more about it and its future. So thank you very much, Helena and Darren, for a very interesting conversation that I'm sure could have gone on for much longer. And yeah, I think we'll see many of you again next week. And please do pop emails to either of our presenters if you've got further questions, and definitely check out Eye of the Pangolin to give you a more in-depth story about what's going on at the moment.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.